what is the general uh, framework that is MMT? How does it contrast to classical economics? And what are some of the basic misapprehensions that you feel most laymen have about MMT, or sort of the straw men that get thrown out about what MMT actually is?
Yeah, well, stop me if I hit the half-hour mark, because there's a lot in that question. But I know I'm joking. Feel free to interrupt. Yeah, I mean, I think I like to think about this stuff, first of all, kind of sociologically. MMT is what MMTs do, in a sense, right? They're just like in the legal world. Legal realism was a movement. It's a documented historical phenomenon. But if you sort of took a snapshot in 1935 or something and asked 10 of the dominant legal realists what is legal realism, you'd probably get 10 slightly different answers. And there is a common thread there. You can sort of superimpose them and start to see a common outline. But there isn't just one thing. And a lot of people have a problem with that, because they're trying to pin it down. They say, give me the one article or the one book or something. And you're like, well, give me the one book on string theory or something. There might be a dominant book or something, but you're going to find other people that are going to disagree about things around the edges, or what the priority should be, or how you frame things. So I like to start from that point, which is that this is a living, breathing intellectual movement, and people are people. They're complex. They have multiple layers. That said, there is a common element. There is a set of sort of foundational principles and things. And I think one of them is that money isn't what the neoclassical sort of standard orthodoxy suggests, which is neutral and valueless and a side issue really to the real underlying system of production and real goods. That old line, I think it was Frank Hahn said, the problem with most economics models is they don't have money at all in them. They just don't, it's just not there. And that idea that you can sort of just superimpose it onto a model of real relations underneath is not true. That money is itself a site of power, of politics, of investment, of change, of technological contestation. And, that idea that we have to take money seriously, I think, as Schumpeter said, monetary analysis should be the starting point. We have to think of everything through that lens in a monetary economy. And in some senses, the monetary layer is almost more real than the real layer, in the sense that you can say what a real wage is. Well, it's the dollar wage adjusted for inflation. But inflation is itself a contested term that you will choose one metric or another. Contested. And depending on which metric you choose, you might adjust that dollar value to a different number. So we can have 25 different theories of how to adjust that to get a real wage, but at some point, the one that's actually there that we're looking at is the dollar value. And then we apply, theory to it, et cetera. And in some sense, people like Hyman Minsky would say you can look at the entire financial economy as a series of balance sheets and numerical statements, not because the real economy underneath is not important, but because that's sort of in the way that we use words, and words govern our actions, that the numbers govern the underlying dynamics to a very large degree. So I think with MMT, it's first of all, it's denaturalizing money, and then it's trying to tell an alternative story. And the standard story is that some sort of public authority, it could be a modern nation state, it could be a religious authority, it could be a temple, it could be a warlord, it could be all sorts of things. It could be a democracy or a commune. It could be a bunch of friends in a share house. Will come up with some system where they use quantified value, right? It's not just, as the anthropologist David Graeber would say, it's not just qualitative, I owe you one in a vague sense, but I owe you specifically X amount, and that can be alienated from me and my relationship to other people and be its own number that stands sort of as a number.
Fungibility, essentially.
Yeah, fungibility, alienability, commensurability, making different numbers equivalent. Right, the idea that you owe me a cow, I owe you 3 chickens, they're not exactly equal, but that's okay, because it's in those differences that we still have bonds. It's like I buy you a round of drinks, you buy me a round of drinks at a slightly more expensive place, and that's okay because we're going to hang out again. But you and I paying exactly $85 is the end of something. It signals the finality of that relationship, and if you don't pay me exactly that much, we're going to have an issue. Right, that's a kind of different way to look at, I think, quantification of social power, social value, social obligations. So the state or some public authority sets a unit of account, starts putting different things in relation to each other. 3 cows is worth exactly, 3 chickens is worth exactly 1 cow, which is worth exactly, you killing my brother, or exactly 1 pound of the crop harvest, or whatever it is. And then we start to have a relative value metric that applies not only for goods and services, but for social behavior, right? don't kill your brother, right? Don't steal someone else's wife or something, don't.
Incentives and disincentives.
Yeah. Punishments, fines, all those kinds of things. And then in order to provision the public authorities, in order to get resources back to the public authority, there have been different ways to do that over time. One is you have people standing there with guns next to people who do backbreaking labor, and you sort of hot stand over them. Another way is you say, you owe me a certain amount of food or rubber or whatever it is every year, and if you don't bring that to me, then we'll come and burn your house down. But another way is to impose monetary obligations, and say you have to pay those obligations, right? A tax or a fee or a fine. But it's not the act of paying the tax that's valuable. It's the act of what it takes to earn the dollars in the first place, earn the currency. And so that's, I think, one of the first big conceptual flips is we often think of paying the money as value, but it's often money as a thing moving around the underlying value. You don't eat money, you eat food, but you buy food with money. So you acquire money to buy food. And you don't eat, the state doesn't eat tax revenue. It's that what you have to do to earn tax revenue might be to sell stuff to the state or sell stuff to someone else, etc. Or if it's the case of a warlord, they might give out coins to all of the soldiers as payment and then say to the conquered population, you have to pay in taxes. So suddenly the conquered population goes to the soldiers and says, what do you need? Do you need food? Do you need brothel services or whatever it is? And that's how the monetary circuit gets set up. And now that's a pretty kind of violent hierarchical story, and in many parts of history that's sort of how it worked. But there are also versions of that we can tell that are more communitarian and democratic. And I used the example before of a share house. Actually, a colleague of mine who was sort of, I met early in the MMT days, she lived in a share house where they had chores to do. To keep the house running, you need to do your chores. So they had essentially a chore system, and they would assign different points to different chores depending on sort of how unlikable they were or things like that. And they would agree collectively what those points roughly were. And then each person, as part of their sort of inhabitation of the shared house, would have to earn a certain number of points every month. And, there's no tyrant there. There's a sort of self-governing democracy, but they are imposing an obligation on themselves, right? In the moment where they're working out those prices, they're putting on their collective governance hat. And then the moment when they're out earning it, they're in their individual hat. And so their story doesn't have to be tyrannical, doesn't have to be anti-democratic. It can also be communitarian, even if that's not historically a lot of the times that it's happened. But essentially the state imposes these obligations, and then in forcing you to acquire them or incentivizing, depending on how you want to think of it, they create a monetary production circuit where people will do things to earn the money and pay back to the public authority. The second layer is that once that exists, once people are starting to think in a common unit of account, once they have an instrument or some sort of account value recorded somewhere, either in an object or in a spreadsheet somewhere, that they know other people will want, because everybody lives under the same system, right? Death and taxes. There's nothing certain in life except death and taxes. In that world, suddenly that instrument becomes a useful one also for private exchange, for private investment. And suddenly, rather than using other things, you could use that as the basis for making payments between actors. So that core public circuit gets augmented with private behavior, which is sort of opposite to how we think of it in a standard economic story. It's like a Robinson Crusoe island and three people come together and they start mutually trading, and then an authority comes in. But the reality is most people grow up in social units. The social unit exists first and you have a place within it, rather than vice versa. Most of us aren't reforming societies out in the high seas every generation. The other thing I think it's important to note here, which is I would say a almost legal extension to the original MMT case, and I don't want to assume that every MMT economist would go that far, but I think most of them agree, which is we often talk about this in the context of taxes, or in the case of maybe colonial, or imperialism in the case of some sort of forced obligation. But in a modern economy where you have private contracts and private property rights and accounting conventions for business entities and limited liability corporations that have to be chartered by the state, things like that. In that world, private actors incur all sorts of legal liability risk that is either enforced by the state or sort of exists under the shadow of the state. Even if you never go to a courtroom, you're still using contract law as the basis of your your negotiations, or even if you settle outside of the judge making a final decision, it's still the threat of what would happen if you went through the court system that shapes that commercial exchange or interaction. So I give examples.
It's ultimately based on the monopoly of power by the state, right?
Yeah. The idea that that we set what the law is, right? You as an individual can resist
and enforce it.
Yeah, you can resist the law when you cross the street against a red light. You can resist the law when you march with Martin Luther King. You can say, I don't recognize this state's authority, like the Bundys or something, or the Confederacy. And states come and go. Public authorities come and go. So there isn't this sort of one eternal sort of state above all of us. It is itself a contestable, malleable space, but relative to individual actors, or more importantly, relative to private markets, we don't have these underlying institutions of contract and property and tort and all these things, accounting and business organizations, without some relationship to a more common public legal authority, whether that's sovereigns or whatever else. And I think it's important there because often people hear, taxes. They think MMT means you create the value of money because you impose a tax. Well, what if we had no taxes? What would happen then? And my answer is we'd still be in a web of legal obligations. Even if you had zero obligations today, can you really honestly say to yourself you have zero risk of incurring legal obligations today? You could walk down the street and someone could bump into you and fall over, and the next thing you know, you have a lawsuit for causing injury to them. Or you could go out into the middle of the bush, prepay your property taxes for 100 years and try to live rogue. And again, somebody could come onto your land and fall over and say you didn't put a sign up, and that's it. Or whatever else could happen. So to me, at least, we live in a constant fog or web of legal liability risk. And the risk is enough. It's almost like an electron cloud. You don't have to know where the electron is to know there's a probability that it's anywhere in the cloud at any point in time. So the sort of strong form, the concrete form, is the taxes drive money. The softer, more sort of contingent form is legal liability drives money. And legal liability can include those affirmatively imposed public obligations, but it can also include private obligations that exist because there is legal institutions mediating private and constituting private market dynamics.